Welcome everyone to our event, My Life, My Business. Wish I was here, and a special welcome to Shanaz and also with Julia, who's in the background, tweeting, taking notes. And yes, today it's Shanaz's turn to present the topic. And as usual, we play Russian roulette. We don't know what's going to happen. So over to you, Shanaz, and I'm really interested to hear what you got to share with us today.
Hi everyone. So I think that after last week, if you kind of listened, I had a few disagreements, or I disagreed with a number of points with the author that um that you mentioned. And I think that we kind of I got this idea that okay, so maybe I should share a little bit about the kind of theory based theories that I use and what we teach our students a little bit in social work, but in some of it is used in psychology as well, and how that has changed from a very individualized look. It doesn't mean that in terms of an individualized look that everything determines how the person thinks or what is going on for the individual, and how we incorporated a lot more work and theory and thinking and approaches to understanding how the person is influenced and affected by the environment. This has kind of started a while ago, and so I'm gonna jump around on a few things, and I hope that it's going to make sense. But I do want to say from the very start that I wouldn't be in this profession, neither would others be, if we felt that people are not able to change, and that people can't. I wouldn't be doing social work if I felt that their fate, people's success was determined only by whether they were in a successful family or had a successful environment. So I want to just say that. And so one of the main um theories that we really use in our work, and in therapeutic work as well, is it's based on this idea. A lot of people do use him. It's called he's Yuri Bronfenbrenner, and he was a a Russian American psychologist, and he was concerned about the fact that psychologists around him and others were only focusing as they thought people were developing. They based the outcomes and the ideas and assessments on the person, or yeah, the success of the person, the assessment of the person was solely based on how the individual develops, so the personal development, in other words, right? So he was concerned about that because they did not take into consideration the person's environment. And so he developed what he called it a bioecological model. And the idea is that what he wanted to do was, he said that he wanted to put the development of the person back into the environment and within the social context, right? So that means that when we work with people and when we understand ourselves, that we don't only understand ourselves in context of what we've achieved, for example, or what we have not achieved, or we base our areas of success, and we base our areas of development only on our personal growth, but that we consider the context in which we are developing in as humans. And so he developed this model. And so um I'm going to tell you a little bit about the different parts. So in this model, what he calls is, if you can think of it as, those ration dolls. There's always one in each other. I forgot what they called, but if you can kind of picture those dolls that you kind of open it up, and there's a smaller doll and there's a smaller doll. So I think of it like that. And he says, so he talks about the microsystem. So the microsystem really, and we talk about systems work as well. So the microsystem is basically you, the individual person, and the immediate physical and social environment. So think of a child and their immediate physical and social environment is, let's take a 5-year-old child. The immediate social environment would be their parents, would be their home, would be sorry, would be their siblings. It may also entail a preschool teacher or something. So that would be the microsystem. So what he was saying is that, yes, those dolls. Thank you, Jacques. So he says that the child will also then be the child's development will then be dependent on the microsystem, right? So how the child develops will then be dependent on those relationships that the child is involved in, right? So think of yourself. So your development would have been dependent on those things as well, your family that who raised you. Then the next thing he speaks about is the meso system. So that's the next level. Think of it as the next level. So this would be the relationships or the interrelationships between individuals. So the individual is the microsystem. So then the interrelationships. I'll give you an example. So children who experience stress at home, they go to school. And so we're using the 5-year-old as an example. So they experience, maybe mom and dad is arguing. So they go to school and they display some disruptive behavior, pushing and shoving a child. And in that way, then and it affects their learning at school. They're not focusing. That is the interrelationship between what is happening at home and what is happening at school. And that's called the meso system, right? So what Bronfenbrenner is saying is that any for any person that's developing, so this development, it doesn't have to be a child, it can be across any level. So if you are an older person, because we still develop, up into there's still certain functionings, that things that we've got to do. So even as an elderly person, you also still developing in and going through different stages of life, right? So that development of yours then will then be influenced by the different microsystems of other people. So in other words, how that person, as I said, the school, so they will, so that child will not be performing well, right? So for example, if I'm thinking of an older person, the adult children has decided to get married, so they're leaving home, and they say in a relationship that the parent is not happy with. So the child's, who is an individual, there will be maybe an argument between the parents. So you see then the interrelationship. So now, because they're arguing with the parents, they go, and then their relationship with their partner isn't so well. So then you can see how the interrelationship between the parents and the adult children. So you can see how it affects others. So in other words, we are all connected by our environment, and our development is all connected in this way. Then he talks about the ecosystem. So this is again the links between the social settings, right? So, in other words, we may not be directly affected by it, but we are influenced by it. So, for example, if we're thinking and we're using the 5-year-old child, The 5-year-old child, the parent loses their job, right? So the child and cannot pay any longer for extramural lessons, or for extra maths lessons, or for ballet lessons, etc. So that affects the child. So that is the ecosystem. It didn't happen to the child, but the child is indirectly affected by it. For example, like I said, if we're using the older person as an example, maybe something changes in, let's say, something changes at, the person retires, right? So, although that is something directly, but maybe there's a policy that, or at the work that says, that government introduced, or that the employers introduced, so that person will be affected by that will be affected by that policy, which may not it may not be directed at them, but it may influence them. And so it's these links then with different social settings, and the settings could be in the community, for example. The settings could be in broader society, for example. So it's thinking about this, right? So what the next layer, which is like important, that he talks about, is called the, which we immediately, when you think about it, it's the macro system. And so you we I need to think, when I'm thinking of myself and my success or my achievement, then I'm also needing to think of the larger system, cultural system that I live in. So what is going on in the macro system, what's going on in government and social policy, but also culturally what's happening. So when I think of myself in those systems, for example, being my age and not having children is like frowned upon. And so maybe for some women, not being married, for example, or not having children at a particular age, they may view that as, as something, they internalize it, and they may think that that's a problem with me. But actually, when I understand myself within the macro system that I live in, I understand actually that is culturally, those are cultural norms that isn't uh, and those are cultural norms, and that isn't me personally. So I need to rethink, or when I work with someone, I'm helping them think about, is it due to themselves, or is that within the larger system, the macro system? And the same thing, for example, with our economy is in such a bad state that a lot of people feel to blame, and they internalize their retrenchment, they internalize not achieving, and they see it as an individual problem, they see it as that they are the problem. And yet, when you actually consider the macro system that we live in and the society that we live in, that the unemployment rate is so high. So in that way, if I can help that person see that, then I'm possibly able to help them, because we are thinking in all of these, we are working and thinking of the person in the environment. And so the problem is that a lot of our earlier work in social sciences was not only was excluded the cultural context, right? Excluded power relations. It excluded the effects that race has on policy and the outcomes. It excluded class, for example, and gender, for example. So what you then have is, when you are not considering and working with a person, and you don't think of yourself in relation to your social context and all these different levels, you will what you'll do is you will internalize it and blame yourself for some of the things and some of the lack of success, which is not actually got to do with your character, your achievements, or your abilities, but it's got to do with the society and the system that we live in. And so when we work with communities and when we work with people, we always ask our students to think about the society that person lives in. We also expect them to think about all those different links, all the different settings that I have spoken, that I have mentioned. And so, so does it, so how does it come down to, like, um so the other thing that I want to mention, like, the other aspect of the development, for example, is around brain development. And just so that you know, so twin studies, right? So there's this thing in research called, it's called twin studies, right? So twin studies are very interesting ideas. They produce very interesting research, because with twin studies they look at that nature and nurture debate. So, like, how much of a person's success or lack of success is determined by their genetics, and how much is actually determined by the environment. And some of the most recent results are very interesting. Number one, they say it's very complex. What they have found, so that certain components of the brain um, are responsible for, is largely genetic, right? And so one of the studies that they found is that, one of the studies, and it's a 2024 study, they found that so with cognitive development, in terms of your attention that you have, your ability to focus, right, that seems to have a large genetic component. Now I want to also say that when children grow up, right, under the age of 5, if a child has experienced severe traumatic experiences or lived in poverty where they were underweight, the brain will actually not develop properly. And that can set that person on a trajectory that they are going to struggle forever. And there are certain delays that mean that the person will actually never be able to recover from that kind of adversity, in a sense. And so maybe these people may actually have special needs, or even things like they score high, they are, what do we call it now, they are functioning, they functioning people, but they are neurotypical, atypical. They're not neurotypical. Neurotypical is when there are no issues. So neurodivergent, that's the new word, right? So they will actually, and because we of our lack of resources, you actually find that a lot of these young people and children are they haven't been diagnosed, right? And but they may score somewhere on the autism spectrum. They may score highly, and they could probably function in mainstream schooling. But what I'm saying is that that is sort of the end, where you can't, which genetics unfortunately plays a big role. And that could be due to, some of that is sometimes genetic, and some of that is actually due to the environment. And that is why child poverty, for example, and child nutrition and maternal nutrition is such a big issue in the work that we do in society and that we need to work on, because it just has all these knock-on effects on young people and children and their future. Listen, so so what they're actually saying is the emotions, this seems to, the genetics seem to play a small role here. And it could be that this is the one that the environment determines. So, when we think of brain development and we think of the nurture and nature debate, different parts are responsible for different functionings. And when we can find, so it seems like the emotions are connected, the environment, what we can then do is think about how to support people around their perceptions, around for example, they talk about how people processed fear and happiness. That seems to actually share equally, for example, the environment and the genetics. What that ultimately then means is that that's an area that is hopeful and that we could work on, right? And so the amazing thing then about the brain is that it's a muscle, and that learning around emotions and learning around emotional awareness and emotional intelligence can be an area where people who struggle can actually, if we focus on that, then they can achieve and they'll be able to reach some of their goals. But now this does bring me on to, I'm going to just speak very briefly, it brings me on to this idea of resilience, because it does kind of touch on about resilience. And so the latest research then on resilience, we in the past we always used to think that resilience is about characteristics that people have. The newest research, they want the newest research is that resilience is an outcome of mediating processes, right? So we are not born resilient, in other words. There are processes in our lives, across our lives, that can help us to become more resilient, that we can display um, characteristics or traits of people who have resilience, and that resilience is actually a process, that um, it is not a character. And earlier research, however, only focused on resilience being where the person holds particular characteristics or had a particular personality. What they say is that it's about again, they say, so the definition that my one colleague kind of developed, he says that it's multi-level processes that the person then engages in to obtain a better than expected outcome in the face of adversity. And when he says multi-level, he's talking about processes that occurs across the environment and the person's social setting. What that means is that while we are not born resilient to a certain extent, we're not born resilient. If we can help people who experience adversity, if we can help them and expose them to, for example, different opportunities, if we can expose them to mediating processes. This can be different things for different people. It can also be, it can also be different. It can also be resources, for example, that we help people access. right? So in other words, it's a process, and if we and the work that I then do is about helping organizations and helping people gain access to those yes, you, I do see that question. Yes, so we can, and that's the thing, it's the environment experiences that actually gives rise to outcomes where people achieve better than what they were expected to achieve, right? So it's the right environment. So I want to work with the children at our church who come from poor families. I want to expose them to the right environments, the right activities, so that they, and expose them to those mediating processes, so that at the end of the day, they become resilient, or that they've been exposed to resilience processes. And I think you asked about, so one can be nurtured. So yes, that does mean that one can be nurtured. But what we do need to acknowledge, he says, is that there are chronic adversity where people are, there is no such thing as invulnerability. There is chronic adversity, which happens a lot in global south environments, where there's nothing that is, the resources are going to run out or have run out. And then it's very difficult for those people then in our traditional sense to think about resilience, because and then we need to adjust the way we think about resilience. And so maybe then that resilience and success will mean very different things for different people in different contexts. And then just to add again, like I said, that this is then the kind of work that it's when, and I think that the idea for me then as a social worker, what I want to do when I make people aware of this in organizations, is that sometimes when we only focus on the individual and we expect that of the individual, then we unconsciously or unintentionally, we kind of align ourselves with what I would call neoliberal policies, which, based on the idea that you are not successful because there's something wrong with you. You are not successful because, you don't have the skills and the abilities. And also what it does also, it also takes away the responsibility of our communities and our state to provide some of the basic services for government. And I think that sometimes when we only focus on the individual, we can make it very difficult for them to seek. And so that's what I wanted to say, different contexts. And I'm not saying, I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of American writers, and I use a lot of American writers, but I cannot just but I'm quite critical of the context and the very individualized approach that some of them have, because our context is very different. People do not start at the same level.
That is so rich. There's a way too much to unpack and really think about. So I, Shanaz, I mean, this is like a. I'm gonna take this like as a real lecture to chew on. My
Sorry, I
my
didn't mean
question
that.
would.
Yeah.
No, no, I don't. I mean that in a good way. I mean, I just want to say, I'm curious. So the comment that you made, that in terms of nurturing somebody into resilience requires a change of environment. So is there something within the person that we're working with that requires something internal for them to flourish in the new environment so that they can be resilient? Is there any shape or form, some decision that they own? So we acknowledge that the environment, especially in chronic adversity type scenarios, if we take them out of that, because yes, you're right, success would be different. I mean, as you said that, I thought to myself, well, success would be survival and survival of the fittest. But coming back to just a general approach to resilience, would by merely by transplantation, I mean, I use that word with inverted commas, taking one individual out of one context into a new context, there is still something that that individual owns in order for them to embrace the new environment, in order for them to be resilient. And it's just a question. I'm intrigued by that. Does Because I'm not too sure if that's still just automatic.
Yeah, no, there are individual aspects to resilience as well, but I think that it's being aware that it's not only individual aspects, and I think that resilience research has unfortunately been focused a lot on individual aspects.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's about having a combination of both. It's realizing the limitations of only focusing on the individual.
Yeah, I think I'm going to leave it just in terms of that answer. I'm going to leave it to you just to perhaps conclude and to dismiss us.
No, well, thank you. I don't think I'm going to say anything more. Maybe it's something that kind of one needs to think about and go and consider your context and your achievements in terms of your context or what you want to achieve. And it could be that maybe we start redefining what success means for us in relation
Mm,
to our.
yeah, absolutely. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Shanaz. That
you.
was absolutely brilliant. Yeah. And for those listening, listen to the playback on Clubhouse or wait for the edited version to be published on YouTube. Our channel on YouTube is the Mufasa Coaching Practice. So enjoy this conversation. Very enlightening, something to chew on, something to grow by. And yeah, until next week, have a fabulous and engaging time with your life. Thank you.